What's up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. This week, we're going to talk about play boosters and how, at least in my opinion, Limited has changed since play boosters were introduced. So, as I'm recording this, we've had play boosters out for like roughly a year and a half. They first debuted at the beginning of 2024 with Murders at Karlov Manor, so we've really had enough time to sink our teeth in, get a good feeling of what they have to offer, a good amount of time to be able to look back and reflect on how they've played so far, how the formats have played, have they been a net positive, a net negative, and aside from just the vibes of how play booster sets have played, I also really want to get into the strategy side of things, because when I sit down and think about drafting a play booster format compared to a set booster or draft booster or whatever the previous boosters were, those kind of formats, I think there's some real tangible differences there. And I know that some folks have expressed to me that they've had trouble navigating drafts in the play booster era, and yeah, I guess I'm not that surprised, because I do think that drafts and games do feel a little bit different these days. So yeah, overall, this episode is going to be a little bit of a check-in on what's changed in the play booster era of Limited Magic, the ways that I think about Limited a little bit differently these days, and of course, I want to offer some tips if you're feeling that play boosters have left you feeling a little bit at sea as a Limited player. So let's start with a quick rundown of what play boosters actually are for those who only started playing after 2023, or for those who just want a little bit of a refresher here. So in the before times, before we had play boosters, we had three main kind of boosters. We had draft boosters, set boosters, and collector boosters. Draft boosters, as the name implied, were used just for drafting, or, you could buy these to crack packs if you want. But the main packs that were marketed for people that wanted to crack packs were set boosters. These had more than one rare at them. At the time, the draft boosters just had like one rare, I guess two if there was a foil. But set boosters had like 1 to 4 rares, and they were very appealing to people that just wanted to crack packs. The problem was, though, that they were not color balanced, right? You get like a bunch of blue cards or a bunch of green cards or a bunch of cards that were specifically for like the green-white archetype in the set. So you couldn't really use them to draft. So they had to have kind of two separate products. One pack for people that like to draft and one people that like to crack packs. And of course, there's the third kind of pack, collector boosters. We still have these. These are also for people that like to just crack packs. Those are the ones where all your cards are foil and there's the nice treatments, all those kind of things. But basically, what happened was WotC said, hey, now that we've released these set boosters, because these were actually a pretty recent thing too, I think those came out in like 2020, draft boosters just aren't selling anymore. People are only buying them to draft, which makes sense. People that want to crack packs want to crack packs with more rares in them. And we can't really have a type of booster that's not selling, so let's try to consolidate these, right? And they actually kind of build it as like, well, if we didn't consolidate the set boosters and the draft boosters, draft would kind of go away. Because obviously their main objective is to sell packs, and if people aren't buying the draft packs, well, you have a problem there. And so the play booster was born, and they kind of meshed together the draft boosters and the set boosters. These are draftable packs, they're color balanced, but they also have the potential to have up to 4 rares in them. There's also more uncommons on average than you'd find in a draft booster. We only used to have 3 uncommons back in the day. Now you can have anywhere from like 3 to, I think, 6 in some sets. So some sets have like extra slots where you can have extra uncommons in there. And so when they announced play boosters, they also gave us this little graphic here that kind of laid out each slot in the play booster packs and what might be in them. And it's actually kind of complex. I'm not going to go through it all here, but basically it amounts to there's going to be more uncommons in each pack, more rares in each pack, the potential to be 1 to 4 rares. And also, if you're counting here, the slots here, 1 fewer card slots. So there used to be 15 cards in a pack. There will now be 14 cards in a pack. They also announced that these play boosters were going to be an opportunity for them to kind of change how they design Limited, and there's some Limited specific implications for these play boosters that we're going to touch on in a few minutes. But I kind of want to just touch on what we talked about so far, because if you weren't there for this announcement, you can imagine that this might have caused some concern for long-time Limited players. It's like, okay, hold on. Things are changing. Draft has been a certain way for 25 odd years, and we're kind of upending things here. We're having some significant changes. The big ones, of course, being that there are going to be more rares in each pack, which means that more rares in each draft, which means that every game of Limited you play is going to have more rares in it. And 2, there's not going to be 15 cards in a pack, which means that you wheel fewer cards. There's just fewer cards to choose from. And so I kind of just want to start by taking a look back and seeing if these fears have panned out and if they were, as big of a concern as they might have felt like to some people at the time. And yeah, let's start with the rares. So more rares in the set doesn't necessarily mean more bombs, right? Because rares can vary in power level. It's not going to be all Ugins and Elspeths, although you wouldn't know that, looking at Tarkir, because Tarkir was a pretty bomb-heavy set. But at the same time, we've had 8 sets at this point that have had play boosters, and I haven't felt like it's felt overly bomby. I definitely think there's some non-play booster formats that have felt more bomby than the play booster formats. Like in the past 5 years, I think that Crimson Vow and maybe like Lost Caverns of Ixalan, those felt more bomby than any format we've had in the play booster era, in my opinion anyways. And I think there's a few factors at play. So going in to this new era of Limited, R&D kind of knew, okay, well, there are going to be more rares running around. We need to account for that. And one of the things they did is they made removal better across the board. Common removal, specifically. Like, look at Tarkir. We get the Cycle of Exhales. All very good interaction spells. We now have Oblivion Ring style effects at common, which was something that was exclusively reserved for uncommon for a very, very long time. We get one of those basically every set. When you're looking at red removal spells, kind of like the bigger red removal spells, one of the things they did, consciously, is instead of having the big red removal spell deal 5 damage, they said, okay, we're going to have the big 4 or 5 mana removal spell in red deal 6 damage, because that's going to kill most bombs, right? And, Crash and Burn from Aether Drift, that was the 4-mana instant and either destroyed a vehicle or dealt 6. Like, that was a perfectly playable card. I was happy to have a few copies of that kind of card. These expensive red removal spells used to be like, kind of crappy removal you didn't want to play. But no, I think they've done a good job of making you want to play the removal. And there's just a little bit more of it running around, too. So yeah, while there are more rares for sure, there's also more answers. And so, it might affect how you play the games a little bit. You might say, okay, I gotta save the removal spell for their rare because they're more likely to have a rare. It does mean that you're not just caught high and dry when they play their rare, which was a very common experience in pre-play booster Limited. I actually think this is a really good improvement overall, the shift up to more removal. And I don't think they could have made this shift up to more removal and better removal without adding more power to the threats, because then you get the dynamic of, well, if the removal's too strong, then, control decks are just too good, aggro decks just are too weak. And so I think actually it was a net positive having more rares in the format, because then they were able to juice the removal a little bit more and have a little bit more of it. And since they're able to print a few more removal spells at common, another thing they sort of smoothed over, I don't know if this was their intention, but it kind of played out this way, is I rarely have the experience anymore of just like, man, I just didn't see any removal in the draft. Or I saw one removal spell, but there was a really, really good creature, and, the creature's much better, so I had to take that. I rarely exit a draft being like, well, I just didn't see removal. And, you might be stuck with some of the lesser removal in the set. You might not get 4 copies of the premium removal spell in your color. But again, I don't think it matters as much, because even the kind of crappy removal spells aren't the worst cards in the world. If you're spending your high picks on high quality threats, then it's kind of an okay trade-off to have a little bit less powerful removal in your deck, I feel. Another design trick they implemented to offset the number of rares you'll see each draft is the really busted ones. They've made them more difficult to cast. So, for example, if you remember way back to Murders at Karlov Manor, there was Ezram, Agency Chief. This is the one white, blue 5/5 flyer that investigated, and you could give it lifelink or hexproof for vigilance. A really, really strong card. And you don't want that card to be costed at 3 blue-white, because then just any white drafter or blue drafter is going to pick it up, pick up some fixing, be able to play it. There will be some number of Ezrams at a table, because the person that rare drafts it or, speculates on it, because maybe they think maybe I can get this white, blue card in my deck. They end the draft and they say, okay, I didn't pick up the fixing. I can't, in good conscience, play this extremely difficult to cast card. And there's just fewer Ezrams that hit the battlefield. Also, this means that if there's a less good color combination, and that color combination has a really, really strong rare, that rare is going to make its way to the person drafting. Let's just say blue-white is the weak color pair in a set. It's going to make its way to the blue-white drafter a little more often, which means there's more incentive to draft a kind of not-so-great color pair. So overall, I think the increased number of rares that you see draft and draft out wasn't that positive on Limited. I mean, I think there's always going to be those people out there that would prefer their Limited formats to be a little lower power. There's always going to be the people that complain that they lost to bombs. That's not going to change. If there's only one rare in the format, people would be like, I faced that one rare. It might even happen more often, right? You might hear people complain like, I faced that one rare. How unlucky am I? You're always going to have those kind of voices out there. But I think a kind of underrated aspect of there being more rares in the format is just that you get to play with more interesting and more powerful cards more often. And I think, well, power creep is a concern. I think that's something at Wizards that they are working on day in, day out. It's something that they're trying to keep under wraps, not to get too out of control. I don't think power level has blown out of proportion. And people really like playing with cool cards. Like, people really like being able to take their rare, play their rare. It's really nice when you open a pack and you have the option of 3 good rares to take. Or, it's really funny to send your friend a screenshot being like, I had to pick between Ugin and Oreni in my draft. And like, which of these awesome cards I'm going to take. Like, that's kind of cool, I think. I think for the diehard limited community, this sentiment is not going to be as loud. But, I think for the vast majority of Magic players who participate in drafts, rares are cool. Rares are good. You want people to play with rares. You don't want people to feel bad being like, well, I opened my pack and there was a land and I never saw a good rare. My deck's, kind of sort of crappy. I think as long as there's good counterplay to these rares, which, like we've gone over, I think there is, it's a net positive. Also, there's just more room for kind of funky rares, right? So something like Scavenger's Talent from Bloomborough, if you remember that one. It's like the black talent that makes a food when something dies, and you can, like, whenever you crack a food, you can mill the opponent. Like, that's the kind of rare that maybe people would rare draft and you never get to see back in the non-play booster days. But with more rares running around, people rare draft a little bit later, and maybe you get something like Scavenger's Talent, 6th pick, 7th pick, and you go, okay, I'll try it. It's my, 20th draft of the format. I want to kind of do something interesting. So I think that's a positive aspect of it as well. And just anecdotally, I don't think I've heard too many people being like, play boosters are all about the rares. And honestly, I'm surprised. I actually thought there would be more people out there that were voicing their displeasure with that aspect of play boosters. But no, I think it's mostly been fine. So, the vibe check, if anything else, is there for me. It's positive vibes for the most part. Like I said, there's always going to be people who dislike certain things about limited formats. But overall, I think this increase of rares has been a good thing. But now let's talk about the other big change that people had concerns about, which is there only being 14 cards in packs now as opposed to 15. And this one, I don't have as many nice things to say about it. So I've got up here the original article from Mark Rosewater that just talks about play boosters and, the changes they're making. And, rightly so, I think he predicted that a very common question would be, why are there only 14 cards? And so he addresses that directly. And he says, the change to the play booster gave us the ability to rethink how we put together a booster. Boosters have always had 15 cards, but that's what Richard Garfield chose to do with them in Alpha years before designing draft was a thing. We experimented with different amounts of playable cards per booster and found that 14 did the best job of giving us the play experience we wanted. One of the reasons we went down in commons and set boosters was addressing a common complaint from players that there were too many cards that didn't get used. Part of adapting to play boosters included making less unusable commons in draft, which made the 15th card less necessary. Now, I'm not really somebody who's like mega critical of WotC and play design. I got my grievances here or there. But, I'm not one of those players who's, always on Twitter complaining about, the weekly thing that they don't like WotC did. But, I can't help, even me, I can't really help but think, is this not just a cost-cutting measure? I mean, sure, Mark gives the explanation here of like, okay, well, with set boosters, players want fewer unplayable cards. But I think it's a problem you can address just by designing cards differently, and they have done that, right? And one thing we're going to get to in a few minutes is I think they've actually done a very good job of making it so that all the commons matter much more than in the pre-play booster packs. And so I guess this explanation just doesn't really hold that much water to me. I mean, sure, I don't know all the inner workings. I'm sure there's multiple factors at play. There always is. These are generally complex decisions. Mark also says here that they test out different numbers of cards, so I'm sure they did try 15 at some point. So maybe I'm just being overly cynical with this. But, I have definitely felt that missing common. And I know a lot of players have expressed a similar thing where it's like, you kind of feel that lack of, cards 43, 44, and 45 in your drafts. And it's not even so much like, it's harder to make playables because there's just more playable cards in the pack. So I don't really feel like that's been true. But it's kind of just like, why not? Why not keep it to 15 cards? I don't know. Like I said, maybe I'm being overly cynical. If there's good reasons that I'm not thinking of here, not to keep it to 15 cards other than just a cost-cutting measure, let me know. Maybe there's just, an aspect of this that I'm not looking at. But yeah, I mean, all I can say is I wish we were back to 15 cards. There's actually been a set or two, I can't remember which one, maybe even just one set, where we did actually have 15 cards in the play booster era. And I remember being like, oh wow, this feels so much better. So yeah, credits due for the way that they implemented more rares, but give us our 15th card back. That's what I'd like to see. And then finally here, the third big thing that people were worried about with the introduction of play boosters is, of course, drafts getting more expensive. Paper drafts specifically, of course, on Arena, it's just been the same price since Arena's inception. And I can't say I feel this too much personally because 95% of the Magic I play these days is on Arena. But I do know, I've heard stories of people being like, hey, my F&M drafts, they don't fire anymore because there's just not enough drafters there. And it's not because the draft sets have been bad. I think in the past year and a half, we've had some really good draft sets. It's been because, some people are priced out of it. Some people will just choose to stay home and play Arena. Now, the flip side of this is, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, if they didn't hike up the price and have play boosters being a thing, draft as we know it might not exist anymore. So if that's the alternative we're looking at, I'm sure people would prefer that to there being no draft F&Ms ever. But at the same time, it does suck. I'm sure there's some people here watching this video that are like, hey, yeah, like I used to go to F&M all the time, but now that drafts are $20, $25, I don't do it anymore. Okay, so I mentioned a few minutes ago that Play Design had said, okay, with these new play boosters, we can kind of re-examine how we design for Limited, make some changes that we think will just be better for Limited, and I want to kind of talk about those and how they've been implemented and if they've been good or bad. A lot of these are coming from an article called Nuts and Bolts number 16, Play Boosters. This is another Mark Rosewater article. In this article, he outlines the design skeletons that they follow for designing sets. So what he does is goes through each color and just says, okay, for each color, we want these kind of effects. So, for white, it's like a 1-mana creature, 2 2-mana creatures, 3 3-mana creatures. When you go to non-creatures, it's like, okay, we want a Banishing Light effect. We want a combat trick. We want a Disenchant at common. They've also talked about some overall design principles and concepts and guidelines that they've kind of shifted and adjusted, and that's the main thing I want to focus on in this section. So first thing to touch on is we now have 2 gold Signpost uncommons for each color pair in most sets. There's been exceptions here and there, but for the most part, the Play Booster era has seen 2 gold cards for each color pair. And I think it's been great across the board for a lot of reasons. Number one, it gives the out for one of the cards to be not that good or kind of miss or be a little underpowered and not have that archetype feel, really feel affected by that. I'll give the example of blue-black in Ether Drift. So that was the, cares about artifacts. We had one of the best uncommons in the set, Haunt the Network, blue-black, sorcery, make 2 Thopters, and then drain your opponent for the number of artifacts you control. That card is great. The other Signpost uncommon was Haunted Hellride, the 3-mana 3/3 Crew 1 vehicle that whenever you attacked, you gave something +1 and Death Touch and untapped that creature. This card was not as strong, nowhere near as close as good as Haunt the Network. And if we were in a pre-Play Booster set, and Haunted Hellride was the blue-black uncommon, right? Kind of was the reason you wanted to go into blue-black, it might have made the entire archetype flop. So I like that they have a bit more flexibility there, right? They don't have to really have all their eggs in one basket. Another point is that when you have 2 Signpost uncommons for each color pair, you can have your archetypes incentivize slightly different things. So green-whites in Ether Drift, the 2 Signpost uncommons, Lagarin, Soul of Alakria, and Veteran Beast Rider, I think they incentivize slightly different play patterns and slightly different cards you might want to take in the draft. Lagarin being the 2-mana 1/1 flyer that whenever it attacked while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 mounts or vehicles. Veteran Beast Rider being the 3-mana 3/4 that says at the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control. Also has the activated ability 4 mana, give your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn. I mean, that first ability, untap your creatures. That also plays well with vehicles because you can untap the creatures that you crewed with. But Lagarin really wants you to play with mounts and vehicles. Beast Rider, the real payoff is the +1/+1. So it has you prioritizing token makers and ways to go wide. Not only does this add to the replayability of the set, because you can draft a certain color pair different ways, but it also means that sometimes, once in a while, you can draft a deck next to somebody else or close to somebody else drafting the same color pair. And you want pretty different cards, right? I always think that's kind of cool when it happens when you're in a paper draft. And you see what the person next to you drafted, and it's like, oh wow, we ended up in the same colors. Does one of our decks really suck? And it's like, no, our decks are actually both pretty good. We just happen to want different cards because our payoff cards in our color pair wanted something slightly different. And then lastly, this is a pretty simple one, but I think gold cards are cool. I think having more gold cards in sets is just a good thing inherently. You don't have too many. That's when you get Alara Reborn, which is a big problem for those who play that set. That wasn't the greatest draft format. But I think where we are right now with the number of gold cards we see in each set is a really good spot. Gold cards are just interesting, right? And kind of like the conversation we had about the rares leading to more interesting games and just, people getting to play with more cool cards. I think the same thing applies to there being 2 gold cards for each color pair. Next thing up, a change they've made in the Play Booster era, and potentially this is the one that, at least in my opinion, has had the biggest impact on formats feeling different and just better, honestly, is they've really made an effort to make sure that every common counts. And it matters, and every common has a place. If you haven't played pre-Play Booster formats, there was always a handful of cards that you never put in a draft deck. So something like Demolish, for example. This is a 4-mana sorcery, destroy target artifact or land. And, you can make the argument that this is a sideboard card, but it's an extremely inefficient and not very good sideboard card, right? I just don't really think it's worth the slot in the set. And, even if you go a step above that, you'd have some just pretty crappy tricks or pretty crappy creatures that nobody would ever really put in their deck. And the reason that was the case is because in pre-Play Booster sets, there's actually more commons. I think there was 100 distinct commons back then, and now they've narrowed that down to 80 distinct commons, which means that they don't have as many cards to fill out in the card file, right? They don't have to okay, once we got to common 15 of white, okay, what's common 16 going to be? They're really kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel at that point, and they don't have to do that anymore. And we're going to get a little bit deeper into this once we get into the strategy side of things, because I think this is actually a really big deal for learning a set and becoming really proficient, just knowing where all the cards go. Because like I said, every card, almost every card, there's still the cackling slashers of the world out there that, sometimes make their way into Play Boosters, but almost every common has a place, even if it's a niche home. Right. And learning where those homes are is really exciting for me. I think it's one of the cool parts of a learning set. As you get into the set, you're like, okay, well, I didn't play this common very often on week 1, but now that, the good cards are going earlier, I have to kind of figure out how to make the not so good cards work. And that was true for the before times as well. Before Play Boosters, it felt like, in some drafts you'd be in where it's all right, well, I'm clearly in a pod where the good cards are going early. People know what they're doing. And so I have to kind of make the best of the bad cards. And a lot of times it just wouldn't work. The cards were just low power enough, so low power that even if you're okay, well, maybe I can play this kind of crappy card in this deck and maybe it'll be good, it often didn't pan out the way you wanted it to. But I feel like now, if you know how to make the kind of not so good cards work and you know the homes for them, you actually do get pretty rewarded. And the last thing I want to talk about before we do dive into the strategy side of things is in that design skeleton article that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Mark Rosewater mentions that in most sets, there's going to be a common Manalith variant. Manalith, of course, being a 3-mana artifact that taps to add a mana of any color. And, these have historically not been very desirable cards. They've been quite weak cards, in fact, in sets they've appeared in. But the 2 we've had in the last 2 sets, Dragonstorm Globe and Starting Column, Dragonstorm Globe being the 3-mana artifact that taps out a mana of any color, and all your dragons enter with an additional counter on them. And then Starting Column being the Manalith that starts your engines. Then when you get to max speed, you can tap sack this artifact, draw 2 cards, discard a card. Both these cards flew under the radar and ended up being pretty darn good columns. I mean, especially Globe. Starting Column was maybe a bit more niche, but personally, it's a card that I played a lot by the end of the format. And so I just kind of want to highlight that these are probably, going forward, cards to keep your eye on. I mean, they want these cards to be playable, clearly. They want them to be a little bit better than Manaliths have been in the past. So just, for a note for myself, when I go into card evaluation season, I'm going to go in respecting the Manaliths going forward. Not only do they have good effects that often are synergistic with what the set's doing, but they allow multicolor decks in a way that even green fixing a lot of the time doesn't, right? Because a 5-color fixer that doesn't lock you in when you cast the card, it can add a mana of any color whenever. That enables you to splash very heavily if you have multiple copies of this kind of card. And not only are they pushing these as cards, just making them a little bit better than your average Manalith, but I think that the cards surrounding them, just all the other cards in sets these days, make this kind of effect better than it used to be. Because you want this kind of card, a Mana Rock, when you're ramping into a really powerful thing. And when there's more rares out there, there's just more power in packs and more powerful uncommons as well. Well, that means that these go up a little bit in value. They've also pushed raw card draw spells a little bit, made them a little bit stronger than they used to be. And card draw is another thing you really want when you have this kind of card, a card that only produces mana. Putting mana producers and card draw in your deck is just kind of a natural synergy. So yeah, I think there's an edge to be gained here in the early weeks of formats with this kind of card, right? Just knowing that, hey, this isn't a card that should go last pick. This is a card that should maybe go, 7th or 8th pick, something like that. There's going to be a lot of people that completely dismiss this kind of card, and you don't want to be that person. And as always, want to give a quick shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That is the best place to go if you would like to support me or any of my content. There's also a bunch of rewards over there if you want to support me or any of my content. So we want to give back to you if you choose to give to us. There's a link in the description of the podcast feed and the YouTube video to that Patreon. That's patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Thank you so much to everybody who supports the show each week. Could not do it without you. Let's get back to the show now. So now let's move into talking about the way play boosters and all the things we've talked about so far have actually made me think about Limited a little bit differently these days, play Limited a little bit differently. And we're going to start with some general thoughts, and then we'll move into draft navigation and gameplay a bit after that. First thing, the most apparent thing to me is that the average deck you play and the average deck you play against is just much more powerful, much stronger than in the pre-play booster formats. And this isn't just like the top end of my deck has better rares, which I think is true, but there are more uncommons in packs, which means more uncommons make their way into people's decks. And of course, like we talked about, the average common is just pretty good these days. Limited Magic had already kind of been going that direction for the past few years. I'd say, around 2020, 2021, things were kind of going on that upward slant of, okay, decks are getting more powerful, the average card is getting more powerful. But I do feel like play boosters supercharged that and got us to a point where decks these days and drafts these days feel kind of different than they used to. So I want to talk about some points about how I see Limited a bit differently these days. And for people that cube, a lot of these points that I bring up are probably going to make you think, hey, that sounds like Cube. And I think it's a pretty accurate description of what's going on here. The strategy and the theory behind what makes a successful deck shifts along with that power level increase. So first thing is I think the concept of drafting a deck rather than drafting a pile of good cards has never been more important than it is in the play booster era. I think that in the before times, you could more easily get away with just knowing what the good cards were and staying away from the bad cards. If you did that, you'd do pretty well for yourself. But in the play booster era, where most people's decks are just good and they just have good cards, I think these days you really have to have a proper understanding of how to construct a deck. And I'm not saying that just knowing the good cards on rate isn't going to get you a lot of the way there. It is, trust me. Like, if you're just to put this in the perspective of like arena ranks, just taking the good cards like that gets you to platinum pretty easily. But if you're finding yourself as a player that's stuck in platinum, stuck in diamond, wants to get to mythic, I think this is the number one thing in drafting and deck building that is missing or is lacking for a lot of players. It's the fine tuning of archetypes. It's knowing exactly what each deck wants, what each deck needs, and also knowing that, as you're drafting, knowing, well, I'm not seeing these kind of cards for this kind of deck. Maybe I have to pivot into a slightly different and adjacent strategy. I think that matters a lot too. A feeling that I've often had in the play booster era is I open up a really, really good rare and I'm like, okay, great. My chances of doing well in this draft have skyrocketed. And that was very, very true, I think, in the before times where good rares were just harder to come by. You open your pack, you saw one, maybe two rares if you're playing in paper and there's a foil. But now I just expect all of my opponents to have at least one good rare, two good rares in their deck. And so even that edge is no longer an edge that you can gain just being like, okay, I got lucky, I opened up a good rare. I don't think that's as big of an indicator of a successful deck anymore. And I think overall, even though this can be a bit jarring for people that are used to the old ways, used to just like, okay, I have a bunch of good cards in my deck, why isn't my deck doing very well? It might be a little bit of a feel-bad experience. I think it's really good for limited formats overall that most of the skill comes from, hey, my deck is cohesive, I've got the specific cards I need, rather than I have the good cards and you don't. I have a Boros deck in front of me that somebody posted on Reddit, so I hope they don't mind me using them as an example here. But they posted this deck with kind of the sentiment of being like, this is a really good deck, but it 0-3'd. And, I do think it's true. It's got some pretty good cards, like our 2-drop slots pretty packed with the types of cards you'd want in a good red-white aggro deck in Tarkir. Triple Shot Brigade, we've got Fortress Kinguard, we've got good go-wide payoffs with War Effort and Duty Beyond Death. We even got like a good rare or two in there. Voice of Victory, the 1/3 Mobilize 2, your opponents can't cast spells in your turn. For what it's worth, it also has some cards that I prefer not to play, like Dragonback Lancer and Twin Bolt, but, I don't think that's like a critical flaw of this deck or anything. But what I do see as a critical flaw of this deck, and, a reason I'm not super surprised that this deck didn't do that well, it's missing a key part of what I think makes the Boros decks in this format good, which is card selection and ways to keep the cards flowing. Specifically, it doesn't have any Mardu Devotees or Pack Beasts, the 3/4 that is one cheaper for each creature you control and draws a card when it enters. Like, I think those two cards in particular are super, super important to the Boros strategy. And if you're just looking at this pile being like, hey, look, I've got a lot of the cards that make a good Boros deck, you're not wrong about that. But I also think this deck's really missing that critical piece of what makes a good Boros deck. And if that's, knowledge or information that you're not privy to, then yeah, you're just not going to be as successful as you might think you will be just looking at the cards in front of you. Another big thing I felt about the Play Booster era is I don't feel like Limited is like about, quote unquote, about the commons as much anymore. I think it's a lot more about the uncommons and maximizing on synergies revolving around your uncommons and knowing what commons support those uncommons. A big part of this, of course, is that there are just more uncommons in packs. It's not just 3 per pack these days. There can be like up to 6 uncommons sometimes. But I think also the specific cards matter here too, where the uncommons that they design these days really do pay you off for like doing the thing. And again, it's a lot more about cohesive deck building, not just individual card quality. So I'll point to LCI, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, the last non-Play Booster format we had. And, the best deck, or one of the best decks in that format, was Blue-White. And Blue-White was an artifact-centric deck. That was kind of the theme. And I don't think the deck was really good because of the artifact synergies. You had those sometimes. It was really good because a lot of the good commons in that set, like Miner's Guidewing and Waterwind Scout and Ultic Cloud Guard, very good on-rate cards that if you just put these in your deck, you'd win a lot of games because of them. Those were blue and white cards, right? And you just see them a lot because commons were making up more of the packs and more common and all that. And in the Play Booster era, I think things have shifted a little bit towards not just like, okay, identifying what are the good commons and, you want to lean towards those colors. A lot of the time it is, okay, what uncommons did I open or get past? Let me try to maximize on those. Of course, this means your gold signposts and commons, that's been pretty standard for as long as signposts and commons have existed. If you build around them, they'll usually reward you. If you draft your Kishla Skimmers, your 2/2 flyers that say you draw a card whenever a card leaves your graveyard, and you have a bunch of Enoch Wayfarers and Harmonized cards, and, renew cards, all that stuff, yeah, your deck's going to be pretty solid because you've built a cohesive deck. Or if you have a Wingblade Disciple, the 3-mana 2/2 flyer that when you flurry, you make a 1/1 flyer. Well, if you fill your deck with Harmonized cards, so you can keep double spelling and 1-mana cards, yeah, that card's really going to pay you off. It's not just going to be good if you put it in your deck. It's going to be a 2/2 flyer for 3 a lot of the time, but it can be really, really powerful when you build around it. Same with something like Delkovan Pack Beast, the 3-mana 0/4 Vigilance with Mobilize 3. I mean, just on rate, this card's okay. But when you maximize on it, you have the War Efforts, you've got the Duty Beyond Deaths, you've got the Rebellious Strikes, to use a common example, the +3/+0 and draw a card combat trick. That's when this kind of card really, really shines. In some sets are going to be more common focused than others, right? Just like kind of the ebb and flow of how Limited goes. This isn't going to be hard and fast rule for every format, but just the general trend I found is my good decks are no longer, hey, I have all of this one common in my deck. It's more, hey, I have, maybe 6-7 uncommons that are focused around a specific theme, and a lot of my commons are supporting that theme and making my deck more synergistic. Although everything I just said is not true about Writhing Chrysalis, but we don't talk about that card. That was I think an abject design mistake that if they went back, I'm sure they would fix. Writhing Chrysalis is the kind of card where you just put that card in your deck and you'll win a lot of games. Next point, and this is a quick one, but as I've played more and more Play Booster formats, I've just realized, all of my decks just want 5-6 pieces of removal. Not only to deal with the rares, of course, but with the point I just talked about with the uncommons and uncommon engines being important, synergy pieces. Removal's just really good to break those up, right? Your opponent's deck looks a lot worse without that Kishla Skimmer in play, without that flurry payoff, whatever it is. So I think as they've moved more towards cohesion in decks, not just individual cards mattering, I've really wanted to break up those synergies more often in game, and I found a lot of times I've lost games because I couldn't do that. And coming from the pre-Play Booster era, I was somebody who was like, removal's good, it's important, but they're not the highest picks in the world. I don't feel that way anymore. I really do feel like my philosophy has changed these days. I feel like even aggressive decks that can often supplement removal spells with tricks. You can kind of see them as sort of interchangeable if your aggro deck is good enough. I think even the aggro decks do need to have a good handful of removal spells. So, this isn't anything groundbreaking. I'm sure this is a lot of people's experience as well. But for those who, might just undervalue the removal spells a little bit still, I would just say, yeah, you want to bump them up in your priorities. Another fairly quick point to bang out here, and this is very much in line with the cube philosophy, is that in the Play Booster era, I have taken lands a little bit higher. And, I think good players tend to take lands appropriately. But with the idea of your decks are generally going to be more powerful, there are more good cards in the format, you're not often going to end up lacking playables, you want to be spending picks to make your mana better. As I'm recording this video, the current format is Tarkir. It's a 3-color format, and, obviously you want to be taking lands pretty highly in multicolor formats. But even in the format before that, Aether Drift, I really, really felt the difference between a blue-black deck that had 2 blue-black tap lands, and the decks where I just had 8 swamps and 9 islands. I think it really does make a difference, especially as decks are more cohesive, and you really have to be casting your spells on time, right? You really get punished, I feel, when you aren't able to cast your spells, even like you have to wait a turn or two. Just having consistent mana, having to mulligan less, is a really big deal. And you also, at least that's, for the formats that we've had so far in the past year and a half, you've had more opportunities than you have had before to take lands, because almost in all of the Play Booster formats, we've had lands either at commons, like dual lands, either at common or in the special land slot. So yeah, I would just recommend taking advantage of that. And of course, with more high rarity cards running around, you want the opportunity to be able to play them, be able to splash them. You open up a bomb pack 3 and you're like, oh, I was blue-black and I opened this green-black bomb. I happened to speculate on a black-green dual land and an Evolving Wilds early on. Great, now I get to play it. And my final big thought before we get into draft navigation, and this one's critical. This one I feel very strongly about. I think this one is really what makes the difference between kind of like a solid, medium, limited player and somebody who's really going to excel in the Play Booster formats, is having an understanding of where each of the commons slots in to the format. Like, what place does this specific common have? What decks is it good in? And I'd really recommend not just grouping cards into good cards and bad cards anymore. I mean, there are going to be stronger cards that are generically good, and cards that need a little bit of help or only good in a niche shell. But where before I would say, okay, the good cards, I want to play these. The bad cards, I don't want to play these. It's more, the good cards, I'm going to play in any deck. They're flexible. They go in multiple archetypes. The not so good cards, they still probably have a place. And as you continue to learn the format into week 3, 4, 5, start to integrate those sort of not so great or niche commons into your decks more often. With the Play Booster era, they've done a really, really good job, I felt, of making sure that every common has a place. It's every single card, almost every single card anyways. Maybe there's like, 2 or 3 commons still that I never really want to play. But nearly every common these days is a card that I can see playing somewhere. And I think the skill that you're trying to hone here, and part of winning as you get deeper into a format on the later weeks, is understanding, okay, is this, this not generically good common, is this a card that I maybe want one of in a certain archetype? Or is this common something that really enables this archetype, and I just want multiple of them in this, in blue-red, but I wouldn't really want this card anywhere else? I think this is the biggest non-obvious shift in how you want to think about things a little bit differently, and how I've been thinking about things a little bit differently in the Play Booster era. And I think this especially comes up when you're talking about the kind of tier 2 or tier 3 decks of the format, because a lot of the time, those decks are tier 2 and tier 3 in people's minds, or on 17 lands, because they don't use generically good cards, right? And generally, the generically good cards in 17 lands are going to say, hey, these are good, you put them in your deck, these archetypes, the cards that go in the blue-white deck, they're going to be pretty good. But let's take green-black as an example for Tarkir. And I don't think green-black is like a phenomenal archetype or anything. I don't think it's the kind of thing where it's like, oh, if you know how to draft green-black, you're going to crush with it. But I do think it's the kind of deck where you should be drafting it once every, 30 drafts or 20 drafts, something like that. And knowing that Delta Bloodflies is a good 2-drop in that deck. and knowing that aggressive negotiations, the hand disruption spell that puts a counter on something, is a pretty key part of that deck, and I'm going to want to play 2-3 copies sometimes. I'd also really recommend getting into specifics here, and that's kind of the umbrella for what I'm talking about when in this section in general, just like get into specifics of what makes a card good. I just mentioned Delta Bloodflies and aggressive negotiations. Those are good in green-black. But why are they good in green-black? Well, it might be obvious to say, well, Delta Bloodfly says when it attacks, when you have a counter on something, you do a thing. You make your opponent lose a life. Or, the aggressive negotiations, that puts a counter on something. But getting into specifics of saying, well, actually, Delta Bloodflies is really important because there's not very many good attacking 2-drops in green-black. And green-black is inherently an aggressive deck, and you want to drop the attack pretty well. So Delta Bloodflies plays a pretty specific role, and you might want to play 2 or 3 copies if you don't pick up the the good uncommon 2-drops that attack well. And you also really want 2-drops. You have a place to put your +1/+1 counter on turn 3 when you cast your aggressive negotiations. Or, take a card like Wild Ride. This is the red mana sorcery. Target creature gets +3/+0, gains haste until end of turn, has Harmonized for 5 mana. This is the kind of card that, you might have even heard. Okay, people say it's good in blue-red. But why is it good in blue-red? Well, it's good when you've got evasion, right? And we've got things with trample, or flying, or things that are unblockable, right? It's not just good. It's not just like, oh, good in blue-red because it helps you double spell. I mean, that's part of it, of course, but it really excels in blue-red when your blue-red deck has some Wingblade Disciples, right? The 3-mana 2/2 flyer, because on turn 4, you can go play Disciple, play Wild Ride, haste out 5 damage, and make a bird. Right, that's a really, really big deal. I'm going to cut Wild Ride from a lot of my blue-red aggro decks because they just don't have the pieces needed. They don't have the Wingblade Disciples. They don't have flying or trample creatures or anything like that. And I go, okay, well, this isn't the kind of blue-red deck that wants this, even though, it's important to know that some of your blue-red decks will want Wild Ride. And also, importantly, this goes for the commons that are pretty good. Maybe not the best of the best commons where you're just like, oh, play as many of these as possible and, it's just going to be good. But the ones that are like, yeah, this is a pretty good card, but I'm not sure how many copies I want. So some examples might be like Unending Whisper, the single blue mana sorcery that says draw a card, has Harmonize for 6 mana. This is the kind of card that, I don't mind a copy of. It's a fine card just if you have no synergy with it. But I'll want 2, maybe 3 copies if I have some self-mill. Sig Appraisers to put this in the graveyard and take another spell. If I have flurry cards, really want a 1-mana card, really want a card I can cast twice during the course of a game. Or something like Rebellious Strike, the 1-and-a-white combat trick, target creature gets +3/+0, draw a card. I mean, once again, this is like a fine card to put into any red-white aggro deck, but you really, really want this card when you've got a lot of mobilized creatures, because then you can turn your mobilized tokens into removal spells that draw a card. And if you're just putting this in any Boros deck, and maybe you have 2 mobilized creatures, and that happens sometimes, you don't end up with all the mobilized creatures in the world. Rebellious Strike is a card I might play a copy of, but if I have 5 mobilized creatures, I'm going to want 3 Rebellious Strikes. So yeah, again, just the really important thing about all this is getting into specifics, getting into the weeds of things. And this kind of stuff isn't going to be as important if you're somebody who only plays, the first week or 2 of a limited format, but it's so critical once you get to that week 3, week 4. I really do believe that. Okay, now let's talk draft navigation and the ways that I've changed my thinking on how I navigate drafts in the Play Booster era. I think this is really going to tie together everything we've talked about so far as well. So the whole idea behind draft is you're trying to position yourself to end up with the best deck you could have drafted in your seat by the end of the draft, right? And in the before times, when packs had fewer playables, this meant you were really, really incentivized to try to find the open colors. Because if you didn't find the open colors, the most open lane, you'd often end up with an underpowered deck because your cards just weren't going to be very good. And it was a really, really big punish to be in the wrong colors, to be in the wrong lane. And it was really bad generally to hold on to your early picks for dear life. Because while you might have opened a good bomb, second picked a pretty good uncommon that went with that bomb, if the rest of the draft went on and you just didn't see good cards in your colors or your colors were getting cut, that would lead to a train wreck draft. And this hasn't completely gone out the window, but I felt that in the Play Booster era, it's not as punishing to end up in the lane that wasn't the most open lane. Right? You kind of still want to be roughly in some space that's kind of open. You can't just completely draft against the grain. but it's a lot less punishing. You'll still end up with a fairly functional deck, even if you just put the blinders on to your colors as you took your first card, second card, and you're like, okay, I'm roughly going to be in this spot. And since you'll start with a good rare more often these days, maybe even multiple, right? You like open a pack, you have the option of rare A or rare B, and you're like, okay, I'll take rare A. That's a great card. And you get past the pack, and it has 2 rares in it, and you're like, oh, there's a rare that is of the same color of my first pick. Great, now I have 2 good rares. And then third pick comes around, and maybe if you're lucky, you can get a third one, or you get some really good uncommons in that color. You've started your draft out really strong, and you're kind of incentivized to keep down that path, right? Because, when you start with strong cards, nobody wants to pivot, right? There's this idea of like, okay, draft is all about finding the exact right lane. Not always true, right? Because your early picks, that should influence how much you're willing to pivot. If the gravitational pull of your early picks is very strong cards, you're not really going to want to pivot, even if it means you're not in the most open lane. And so, like, all of these factors together means that I've just not been doing, like, the hard pivot to completely different colors or a completely different archetype all that often in the Play Booster era. I've often talked about the concept of drafting a deck that you're drafting until you can't, which is to say, as you're drafting, don't necessarily look for reasons to pivot. You get to pick 6 and you're like, oh, that blue card, it's kind of late for that blue card. Should I move into blue? If there's a good red card in the pack and you're drafting red, no, just take the good red card, like the solid red card. It might be worse than the blue card, but, keep on drafting the deck that you're currently drafting until you just absolutely can't anymore. And I feel like that mantra has been amplified for me in the Play Booster era. Because, all the factors I was just mentioning. Before, if I had to guess, I would say that before Play Boosters, I ended up in a completely different place than when I started, maybe like 30% of the time, maybe even a little bit more than that. But I think in the Play Booster era, it's like 10% of the time, 15% of the time. So it's like a pretty meaningful cut to how often I'm going to make a hard pivot. And when I say a hard pivot, I'm talking like you take some blue cards early on, and then you take some green cards, and then, 7th pick, there's good cards for like the red-white archetype, and you're like, okay, I'm supposed to be completely in the opposite lane, right? The kind of more transitional, easy pivot, like I started blue, took some red cards, and then, okay, red was open, blue wasn't, I moved to blue, red-green. Yeah, that still happens fairly often, right? I think just smoothly transitioning, that's not something that's too rare still. I also think it's just a little bit more difficult to have the approach of, okay, I'm going to very meticulously read the signals and figure out what's open, and I'll get rewarded in pack 3. Because I feel like pre-Play Boosters, where not all the cards in the pack were playable and strong, it was a lot more obvious when good cards made their way to pick 6, pick 7, like, oh, nobody's touching these. I should take these. But these days, you can get to pick 6, pick 7, and there's like 5 good cards of various colors. And you're like, well, what does that mean, right? Like, sometimes there are pack after pack after pack. You're like, okay, the best card in the pack is blue. The best card in the pack is blue. The best card in the pack is blue. You can say, okay, blue's pretty open here. You can do a little more deducing at that point, but even still, it's sometimes not obvious. Like when you get to the wheel, there's still sometimes good cards in the pack. So just like the act of reading signals, quote unquote, whatever that might mean to you, kind of means different things to different people. It's just a little more obscured. It's a little bit less reliable as far as like what you're going to see in the later packs, because remember, it's not just what you're seeing, which might affect what you see in later packs. You're just one piece of the puzzle here. The good cards your opponents are going to see late, that might be, solid cards, that might incentivize other people to move into lanes that you weren't expecting. So I guess generally I just find the drafts are more chaotic, right? There's more entropy in them. And when there's more entropy, I'm doing a lot less predicting of what I might see, and a lot more, let me look at the pack in front of me, let me just take the best card that reasonably goes with my cards, and I'll kind of build a deck not based on what I think, my end game of like what this deck should look like, but really saying like, okay, I take a card, I add this card to my deck, now my deck is a little more this. It's a little more aggressive. It's a little more controlling. And then the next pick I take a card, okay, it's even more aggressive because the best card in the pack was an aggressive card. And then pick after that, oh, maybe it's a controlling card. So you're kind of like voting different directions with each pick. And at some point you kind of lock in. But like, that's the kind of navigation I've been doing. It's a shift away from the macro of, okay, specifically what colors should I be in and what archetype is the best archetype to be in given what other people are doing. And a lot more, okay, well, I've just been taking strong cards every pick, which I still recommend doing. I don't recommend taking bad cards. I've taken a bunch of strong cards. Where are those cards good? what do they push me towards? What filler cards or support cards will I want to make those cards strong? I've heard a lot of people in Tarkir kind of had the problem of, okay, I start down a Boros aggro path, and everybody else is in Boros too, right? Like, on my first 4 picks were very much Boros, strong Boros cards. And then, like, you know, it's really hard to pivot into like a green mid-range deck with those Boros cards I started with. What am I supposed to do? Well, often my pivoting isn't like, okay, I'm going to pivot to a completely different archetype, because like I said, you might have started with some really, really good cards. More, it's going to be like, okay, well, maybe I'm not the straight up, super aggressive, streamlined 2-color Boros deck, the ideal version of a Boros deck. I get a little more in the middle, a little more mid-rangey. DeFore, you know, Aggro Master DeFore, who's been very much drafting almost exclusively the Boros decks in this format. This is something he's done a lot in this format, where, you know, ideally, great. If you can be that streamlined 2-color red-white aggro deck, awesome. But he's not afraid to be like, you know what? I'm not seeing those cards. And I'm not going to hard pivot. I don't want to move into a green deck necessarily when I've got strong cards. But I'm going to move into a deck that, you know, still uses the early Boros cards that I took, but maybe it's a little more mid-rangey. Maybe I am playing some dragons instead. Maybe I'm, instead of, you know, trying to kill them right away, I have some flyers. You know, that's a bit of a slight pivot. So yeah, I'm more, when I'm pivoting, when I'm changing my strategy as I'm drafting play booster formats, again, it's looking at the specifics. It's adjusting the micro. It's really about the micro. Maybe I'll start with some good blue-red cards and not know exactly if I'm blue-red aggressive or blue-red controlling. I'm just going to let the draft kind of decide that for me. If the strong cards I see are the flurry aggressive cards, great. But if the strong cards I see are the dragony control cards, then I'll go that direction. There's still a lot of options and a lot of choices you can make that don't involve a hard pivot to a different archetype. I guess that's kind of the core of what I'm getting at here. This section has become a little bit rambly, so I apologize if it's a little bit abstract, but I think if you were to take anything away from that, that's what I'm really trying to get at here. When you're navigating drafts, just never stop thinking, okay, now what does my deck look like? Every single pick, right? Now what does my deck look like? Now what does it want? Now is it leaning more aggressive or controlling? Now am I seeing the cards that would be good in an aggressive deck, or are they just not there? I think that it really, really pays off to not switch your brain off when you're drafting, right? Not just go, okay, I've locked in. Now I'll take some cards, and I'll roughly take the strongest card in the pack of my colors. Every single pick, I want to keep readjusting. And that sounds a lot like the advice you've heard, you know, time and time again of like, oh, stay open to pivoting to different colors, stay open to pivoting different colors. It's now more stay open to pivoting to different strategies within your colors. That's, I think, where the difference is. Because pairing your strong early rares, your early picks that you don't have to give up, you want to play those cards, with the puzzle, with the micro decisions of, okay, well, now that I have these strong cards and I'm seeing, you know, whatever kind of cards you're seeing in the middle of the pack, whether they be aggressive, defensive, want you to go wide, want you to go tall, want you to care about counters, pairing the knowledge of, okay, well, how do I make these cards cohesive, and what commons do I want to make this deck an actual cohesive, synergistic deck? That, I think, is what defines success in the Play Booster era. I have a draft in front of me here that I was planning to go through, but we're going a little bit long here, so I won't do that. But I will put the link to this draft in the YouTube comments and the podcast description. I think it kind of highlights some of the things I was talking about here. Basically, if you do choose to look through this draft, the idea was like, you know, I didn't really have that much direction in this draft. I didn't start with a good rare. My first pick was a Dragonstorm Globe. But after pack 1, I kind of looked at my picks of just good cards, again, not much direction, and said, what is this deck good at? And roughly, it was good at being a bit controlling. You know, it's not like the most controlling deck in the world with a bunch of good bombs, but fairly controlling with some good removal spells, and because I had some good fixing and some globes, it was really good at just casting cards of a bunch of different colors. And that's what I leaned towards. I leaned towards, okay, well, you know, in pack 3 and pack 2, later parts of pack 2, I just want to pick up the most powerful cards possible. And I think that's just a kind of an example of all the things I was talking about, like asking, what are my cards good at? What do they want? Let me lean into that. You don't necessarily have to start with a defined idea of what your deck's going to look like in the end. You can kind of just piece it together as you go. Okay, a few thoughts on gameplay, a thought or two on sealed, and then we'll wrap things up. So first of all, I feel like gameplay has become more important, actually, in the Play Booster era. More important to be good at gameplay. Because when most people's drafts are functional and they just cast their spells and those spells do fairly good things, well, it means that you don't gain as much of an edge in the draft. draft, right? Like a lot of the time I used to think of myself as a player who really gained a really large edge in the draft because I felt like I was a better drafter than most players. And I still think I'm a pretty good drafter, but I feel like that edge has been diminished a little bit because you don't get people train wrecking as often. You don't get people ending up with sub-functional decks. People's decks are just pretty good. There's a little bit more wiggle room in there, right? So if you're somebody like me who feels like you really got an edge in drafting before, I'd say like put some emphasis on gameplay. And this is something I say a lot, gameplay is important. But when I look back in the Play Booster era so far, I had formats that I did less well in than other formats, or formats that as I was playing them, I'm like, man, I'm really struggling here. Almost always the problem I realize is like kind of just sloppy gameplay, or maybe I was playing the games in a slightly wrong way, thinking about the games a little bit differently. And so yeah, just kind of want to put that out there if you're somebody who's been dragging your heels maybe on putting some focus on leveling up your gameplay. Drafting a good deck is still important. I just talked for like 20 minutes about how drafting a good deck is still important. But the floor of those decks tends to be a bit higher these days. And then, one that might be obvious, of course, is with more high rarity cards running around and more synergy pieces at uncommon, I think you really want to save your removal spells for the really important creatures, right? The cards that are going to make a difference in games. Especially when you've only got one more removal spell in your hand, I'm pretty picky about where I point that. Or if I've got a card like Awaken the Undead, that's the Sultai Saga, where the first chapter is destroy target non-land permanent. Or if you have something like Stormplane Detainment, the Oblivion Ring, white removal spell, basically anything that answers whatever, destroys or exiles non-land permanent, I'm going to be pretty picky about where I use that. Because not only are there just more high rarity cards that you have to deal with, uncommons, rares, but, I think these days there's just more good artifacts and enchantments running around. Sagas pop up every other set, it seems. Some pretty good equipment running around these days. Some good, weird enchantments running around. So just be mindful of that kind of stuff, right? Don't be too antsy about where you point your removal spells. Obviously, if you're playing an aggressive deck, the point of your removal spells is to get blockers out of the way. That's a little bit different. But anytime you're playing something in the mid-range of your control space, I'm picky about where I use my removal spells. I want to use my creatures as removal rather than just point and click at the first thing I see. And that's always been true, right? That's always been true about Limited. You want to be picky, but I feel like even more so these days. And then, yeah, one thought on Sealed. So it's interesting. I've heard kind of varying opinions. Some people have liked what Play Boosters have done to Sealed, and some people have not liked what Play Boosters have done to Sealed. The people who don't like what Play Boosters have done to Sealed say that, there's more rares, of course, and that's just objectively true. More rares are open. Sometimes you get like the 12, 13 rare pool. And obviously it's going to do a lot better in general than the person who only opens 6 rares. There's a lot more variance in the tippity-top decks in Sealed. You can get more busted decks than you used to be able to. But the flip side of that, the thing I've liked about Sealed in the Play Booster era, is there's very few pools that are unplayable now. And I kind of like that trade-off personally. I think in a perfect world, there's some way to equalize the number of rares that you have compared to your opponents, of course. It's not such a giant disparity when your opponent opens that 11, 13, 14 rare pool and you only have 6 and some of them are lands or whatever. That's going to happen. That's kind of the variance there. But with all the commons mattering and there being more high rarity cards, you almost never get unplayable sealed pools anymore. And that was a huge thing, right? Just like even 5 years ago. I think like 20% of sealed pools, maybe they weren't straight unplayable, but you open up your sealed pool and you're like, wow, I'm just not winning any games with this. And I feel like that happens like 5% of the time these days. So it's kind of a trade-off. Overall, it depends on what you prefer as a player. I don't think Play Booster Sealed is strictly worse or better than non-Play Booster Sealed. It's just a little bit different. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up from here. Thank you for watching and listening. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps the channel. And yeah, we're set review season. It's coming up once again. It's just around the corner. Final Fantasy coming up very soon. Probably going to have one more episode between now and the set review. But yeah, previews coming out, so do be prepared for that. I think we're going to do our set review. I think we've got a date locked in, actually. I think it's June 3rd. Don't quote me on that just yet, but I think June 3rd is going to be the Mark plus Alex set review. Anyways, thanks so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.